And beyond the presidential race, the key question in this election is which party will control the House and the Senate. Wolf Blitzer will be keeping tabs on the balance of power throughout this night. And let's go to you now, Wolf.
Thank you, Judy. Not only is there an extremely close race for the presidency, this is also the first time since 1948 when control of the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives all have been legitimately up for grabs on Election Day. Republicans currently control both the House and the Senate, but by relatively slim margins, which could become even slimmer by the time all the votes are counted. And there are 34 Senate races on the ballot this year. Republicans are defending 19 seats, the Democrats 15, with several just too close to call. Let's take a look at two of the races which could tip the balance of power in the Senate. In Virginia, Democratic Senator Chuck Robb is fighting hard for a third term against the former popular Republican governor, George Allen. And in Michigan, Spencer Abraham, the Republican incumbent, is seeking a second term in a very tight race with the Democratic challenger, Debbie Stabenow. Joining us now to talk about this, Stuart Rothenberg. You'll be with us throughout the entire evening. This Senate contest is critical right now.
Well, Wolf, it's all about pickups, about gains and losses. And in Virginia, as you mentioned, Chuck Robb, Democratic senator, has had a very difficult race against Republican George Allen. He's somewhat of an underdog. The Democrats really need to hold this if they're going to take over the Senate. And in Michigan, Spence Abraham has had a lead. At least he did a few weeks ago. But Democratic challenger Debbie Stabenow is coming on strong. This race is a toss-up. All
right. As happens, of course, every 2 years, there are 435 seats up for grabs in the House of Representatives. Republicans currently hold a 13-seat majority, but with some 36 races too close to call, this could be a long night. Stu, let's take a look at two of the races that potentially could have an impact. In South Florida, for example, longtime incumbent Clay Shaw, Republican, is being challenged by Democrat Elaine Bloom. And in Connecticut, Republican Robert Simmons is challenging the Democrat Sam Gadenson. He's been in Congress for almost 20 years.
Well, Shaw is one of a number of Republican incumbents who are facing difficult races. In order to maintain control of the House, the Republicans need to hold on to Clay Shaw's district and a number of other GOP incumbents. And in Connecticut, you mentioned Sam Gadenson. This race was not on the radar screen a couple of months ago, but local issues and an attractive Republican challenger, Robert Simmons, a state legislator, could prove Sam Gadenson's downfall.
All right, Stu, thanks. Back to you, Bernie.
Pardon me, Judy. Wolf Blitzer standing by, as he will be throughout the night, to bring us up to date on the balance of power. Wolf also has a governor's race to call. Wolf.
Well, let's take a look at the Senate first. No great surprise. Richard Lugar, the Republican incumbent in Indiana, he easily defeats his Democratic challenger, David Johnson, an attorney, former legislative counsel to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Lugar once again wins. Let's take a look at the balance of power in the Senate. No change right now. The Republicans still hold 54 seats. The Democrats 46 seats. There are 33 undecided now, of course, that Lugar has won his seat. Stuart Rothenberg, the Democrats need 5 seats, 5 wins to have a majority. Why 5 if it's 54 to 46?
Well, normally, Wolf, you'd say the Democrats just need to get to 50, and then assuming they elect a president and a vice president, the vice president would break the tie for them. But in this case, the vice president, if he's a Democrat, would be Joe Lieberman, who's also running for re-election from the Senate from Connecticut. So if Lieberman is elected vice president, he'd have to give up his Senate seat in Connecticut. The governor of Connecticut is John Rowland, a Republican who has promised to appoint a Republican to fill that vacancy. So the Democrats can't win the Senate by getting to 50. They need 51.
In the House, we're closely following 2 congressional races, one in Indiana, the incumbent, the Republican John Hostetler, facing a challenge from the Democrat Paul Perry, and in Kentucky, Representative Ann Northup challenged by Eleanor Jordan. 2 races. Let's take a look at the balance of power in the House of Representatives. Right now, there are, of course, still 223 Republicans, 210 Democrats, 2 independents. The Democrats need to win 7 seats, toss-up seats, in order to have a majority. But they really, Stuart, need more than 7. They need 8 or 9, don't they?
That's right, Wolf, because it's one thing to say, what do they need to get to 218? It's another thing to say, what do they get to elect their own speaker? In this case, it would probably be Dick Gephardt. A number of Democrats, at least one, Jim Traficant of Ohio, but others are mentioned as possible defectors, people who might vote for a Republican for speaker. So the Democrats need something of a cushion if they're going to be sure to be able to organize the House.
All right, and we're also ready at this point to declare a winner in the gubernatorial race in Indiana. Frank O'Bannon, the winner. The Democrat defeating David McIntosh, the former Republican congressman. If the Republicans, Stuart, are so easily the winner in the gubernatorial race in Indiana, yet Bush is the easy Republican winner. It seems people in Indiana can split their vote.
Absolutely, and it's the difference between federal races and state races. I think in many conservative, generally Republican states, voters are willing to send a Democrat to the state house, feeling that the Democrat is generally moderate to conservative, reflects those values. I think they're more cautious about sending him to Washington, D.C., where they get those other Democrats there, and their views might change.
And I think we're going to see a pattern of that throughout the night. That's it for now from the Balance of Power desk. Back to the National Desk.
You know, it's interesting to me that Richard Lugar's election, he, like Orrin Hatch, reminds us of something. In Washington, a powerful, respected man. Lugar tried to run for the presidency 4 years ago. He was less than an asterisk, just as Orrin Hatch was this year. There's something about long-term senators, I guess, that doesn't play on the presidential stage.
But I'm always fascinated. We talked about this the other day, Bill Schneider and Bernie. In a state like Indiana, you think of it as so Republican, and yet they've just reelected a Democratic governor there.
Well, times are good, and when times are good, incumbents do very well, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. And so I think we're seeing some of that beginning to show up here. The interesting point is Gore ought to be doing a lot better if times are good. It shouldn't be a close race, as it looks like it will be.
We have, ladies and gentlemen, some Senate calls to make. First, in Florida, Bill Nelson, the state insurance commissioner, has beaten Congressman Bill McCollum. You will recognize him as one of the House impeachment managers. This is a pickup for the Democrats. Connie Mack, the Republican who could have won easily, most people think, retired. In Georgia, Zell Miller, former governor appointed to fill the seat when Paul Coverdale died, has defeated former Senator Mac Mattingly, and by enough of a margin to avoid the runoff that Georgia law requires, this is a hold. And in Virginia, one of the most closely watched, Chuck Robb, the senator and former Governor George Allen, son of the legendary football coach, locked in a race too close to call. Robb was considered the single most vulnerable Democratic incumbent. We are often running for control of the Senate as well. It's still going to be a very long and fascinating night.
All right, let's go over to the Balance of Power desk, arena, I should say, and talk to Wolf Blitzer. Wolf, what are you saying?
Judy, in Vermont, we're ready now to declare the incumbent Republican Senator Jim Jeffords a moderate Republican, well known for his liberal point of view. He has been reelected against Ed Flanagan, the first openly gay U.S. Senate nominee of a major party. Let's take a look at the new balance of power in the U.S. Senate right now. With the win of Bill Nelson, the Democrat in Florida, the balance of power has now tilted one toss-up state going for the Democrats. The Democrats one gain in their need for 5, Stuart Rothenberg, to become the majority power in the Senate.
Well, Wolf, McCollum, of course, was one of the House impeachment managers. He started out behind. A lot of Republican insiders, both in Washington but also in Florida, wondered whether he really had enough appeal statewide to beat somebody like Bill Nelson. Obviously, he closed, but he didn't get over the top.
It would be interesting to look at the exit polls to see if that fact that Bill McCollum was an impeachment manager had any significant impact in his defeat today. Let's take a look at the House of Representatives. We're now ready to declare in Kentucky Representative Ernie Fletcher, the Republican, the winner over former Representative Scotty Basler. It looks like a pretty significant victory. There's no change, though, in terms of a pickup in the House of Representatives. Still the same as it was before. The Democrats need 7.
Well, if this is a big race, though, I think a year ago many insiders would have said Ernie Fletcher is headed for defeat. Scotty Basler, a former member of Congress from this congressional district, a statewide candidate who narrowly lost the U.S. Senate bid. Allegedly, the issue of patient's Bill of Rights was going to hurt Fletcher, who is a doctor. The doctors switched positions. They supported him 2 years ago, but not this time. Instead, that issue did not hurt him. He was successful. He was able to neutralize it at the end of the campaign. Basler turned to guns as an issue. And in fact, the NRA supported Scotty Fletcher, as did the Republican Majority Issues Committee, Tom DeLay's group. This is a big win for the Republicans.
All right, let's take a look at the governor races right now in New England. 2 governor races. The incumbent, Jeanne Shaheen, facing a challenge from former Senator Gordon Humphrey. Right now, the vote is much too early to call, and we don't know who is going to be the next the winner of that race between Jeanne Shaheen and Gordon Humphrey. As far as Vermont is concerned, Howard Dean, the incumbent Democrat, It looks like he may come in first, but he may not get, according to our exit polls, the 50% he needs in order to be reelected. There could be a runoff in that gubernatorial race. Vermont is a state where Governor Dean signed into law the so-called gay marriage rights provision.
Right, civil unions. And really, we've been watching Vermont, which has been trending Democratic for some time, and of course went to the vice president today. We've been watching that state to see whether this issue, civil unions, is going to redefine the politics of the state, re-energize conservatives. Not yet clear.
All right, Stuart Rothenberg will have a lot more. Back to Bernie on the national desk.
Without
Judy,
it,
excuse me. This is. I know it sounds like I'm being rude, but we have a call to make, and it is a significant one. In the state of Virginia, former Governor George Allen has defeated and unseated Senator Charles Robb. Charles Robb, a two-term senator, former governor, once thought to be possible presidential material, involved in various personal problems several years ago, barely beat Oliver North in a very hot race in '94. This time, George Allen has defeated him, and this represents a pickup, and a significant one, because it makes the Democrats' attempt to capture the Senate that much harder. Their most vulnerable incumbent has fallen.
And that means the Democrats have picked up a seat in the Senate in Florida. The Republicans have picked up a Senate seat by defeating Senator Robb in Virginia, so they're even Steven as of right now.
And since it's a 54-46 majority,
that's a good news for the
Democrats'
Republicans.
road got tougher.
Quite an upset there. Son-in-law, the late President Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Married to Linda Johnson.
Chuck Robb.
This is a race, of course, we see many of the ads because, three of us live in Washington, D.C. One of us lives in New York. You don't see as many of these.
The heartland.
Right, the heartland of America, Manhattan, West 57th Street.
Something.
And some of us were born in Virginia.
But we've been seeing a lot of the ads, and they've been some very tough ones in the Robb Allen race. There are many people who said that Chuck Robb in this campaign never really seemed to many people like he wanted it. Now, I'm not comfortable saying that from here, but I think it was something that the analysts...
Well, remember, Virginia has become more and more solidly Republican over the years, and the legislature is predominantly Republican. Now they have 2 Republican senators. The governor has been Republican for some time. Virginia has been one of the southern states that's really drifted into the GOP.
And I think it's fair to say that in 94, it was often said that Robb and Oliver North were each running against the only person they could conceivably beat that year. And in fact, now that Chuck Robb has faced a stronger incumbent, remember in '94 there was an independent Republican that ran against North with the blessing of the other Senator John Warner. This time the Republicans were united and they took it.
Well, since we have some electoral goodies on the table, let's reset the table and take a look at how the balance of power is shaping up at this hour on Capitol Hill. And Wolf Blitzer is here in our election night newsroom to keep us up to date. Wolf?
Bernie, with that Republican pickup in Virginia and the Democratic pickup in Florida, let's take a look at the new balance of power in the U.S. Senate. The numbers are as follows. Democrats, of course, need 5 in order to carry that, to become the majority in the U.S. Senate. We're waiting for those numbers. That's it. The numbers are even. There's no pickup right now because the Democrats have won 1 in the in Florida. The Republicans have won 1 in Virginia. No change so far. There are 2 Senate incumbents who have been reelected. We'd like to call those winners right now. Senator Mike DeWine of Ohio, the Republican, reelected over Ted Celeste. Robert Byrd, the Democrat in West Virginia, the longtime senator, reelected in West Virginia. No great surprises in those 2 races, Stuart Rothenberg. But the Chuck Robb defeat in Virginia is somewhat of a surprise.
Two points. Well, first, in the Florida race, I think the Republicans knew McCollum was behind. They were hoping that he would slide through with getting a draft from George W. Bush. Obviously, that hasn't happened in Florida with the presidential race too close to call. And in Virginia, that's a smaller version of the presidential race. George Allen, a former governor, talked about big government versus small government, very likable, personable guy. Chuck Robb said he could win this election on issues like guns and health care, education. Didn't work out that way. We'll have to see whether it works out that way at the presidential race.
Let's take a look at the House of Representatives, an important race in Kentucky. We're now ready to call Ann Northup the winner, the Republican, over Eleanor Jordan in a tough tough race. Why was this one so closely watched, Stuart Rothenberg?
Because the Democrats do everything but the kitchen sink at Ann Northup. The AFL-CIO was in there very early, advertising very heavily, all Democratic groups. And Wolf, Democrats believe that they're going to have to knock off a handful of Republican incumbents if they're going to take over the House. They thought Ann Northup was in that group. They fell short there.
In the balance of power in the House of Representatives, still no change, no pickups as of right now. The Republicans have won 12. The Democrats have won 8, one independent. It stays as it was before. Let's take a look at the gubernatorial race in North Carolina. We're now ready to call Mike Easley, the Democrat, re-elected over Richard Vinroot in North Carolina, and too close to call in West Virginia, Cecil Underwood, challenged by Bob Wise. These gubernatorial races, there are 11. Some of them do suggest some national implications.
Oh, absolutely. Well, you can't talk about governors in terms of the balance of the power the way you can in the House and the Senate. But let's remember that governors appoint senators if there's a vacancy. We've had some of that recently. They're involved in redistricting and reapportionment, and could be involved in the 2004 presidential race. So governors matter.
So as of right now, Stuart Rothenberg, if we look at the balance of power in the Senate, the House of Representatives, it's basically going as a lot of people, including yourself, had thought would be the case.
At the moment, the election is a status quo election. There are plenty of contests to go. And in fact, for the Democrats in the House, they're looking toward the West Coast, California, Utah, Washington State for big wins there. So we have to wait till we get to a couple more time zones.
Opportunities for 4 or 5 potential pickups in California alone for the Democrats.
Right. Clearly, Kentucky has been a good state for the Republicans this year in the congressional races and the presidential. Let's look elsewhere.
Stuart Rothenberg, we'll be back to you. Back to Bernie on the National Desk.
And while we talk about the presidency, the Senate is up for grabs, and we have some calls to make, if you want to call them calls. Some of these calls are telling you that they're not calls. In Michigan, where Spencer Abraham is battling Congresswoman Debbie Stabenow, we say that race is too close to call. In New Jersey, where John Corzine, the Goldman Sachs executive who dumped $60 million of his own money into this race against Congressman Bob Franks, we are saying at this moment that race is too close to call. Probably one of the most watched Senate races, Senator John Ashcroft running against Governor Mel Carnahan, who died a couple of weeks ago in his plane crash. In a plane crash, his widow, Jean, says she would take the seat if Mel Carnahan gets more votes. That one is too close to call. Now, we are calling Joe Lieberman the winner in Connecticut. But, of course, if Al Gore wins, Joe Lieberman will have to resign the Senate. But if not, he at least has a day job. Now, here is a pickup. In Delaware, Governor Thomas Carper has unseated Senator William Roth, a 30-year veteran of the United States Senate, chairman of the inevitably described powerful Senate Finance Committee. Age was a real issue in this race. Senator Roth had the misfortune to collapse while a TV camera was running. That is a pickup for the Democrats. Roth is out. One of the lions of the Senate gone.
All right, while we're looking at the Senate and some of these other very, very important elections taking place, let's go over to the man who's keeping a close eye on all this, our Wolf Blitzer. He's over there with Stu Rothenberg. Wolf?
Judy, with that pickup, that Democratic pickup in Delaware, the new balance of power in the Senate, let's take a look at where it stands right now. There were 35 Republican holdovers, 31 Democrats, 9 Republican winners tonight, 7 Democratic winners. That brings the new number now 44 in the Republican camp in the Senate. 38 Democrats will be in the Senate. At least 18 races still undecided. We have some other Senate races we're ready to call right now, all as predicted. Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison easily reelected in Texas. In Pennsylvania, Rick Santorum, the incumbent, easily reelected, defeating Ron Klink, the Democrat. In the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Senator Edward Kennedy easily defeats Jack E. Robinson as expected. In Tennessee, Bill Frist, Dr. Bill Frist, the incumbent, he is reelected in Tennessee. In Maryland, another easy race for Paul Sarbanes, the longtime incumbent, beating Paul Rappaport. In the state of Mississippi, the Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott, once again easily reelected. And in Maine, Senator Olympia Snowe, the Republican, moderate Republican, reelected once again. Stuart Rothenberg, There is a change, though, that we're seeing some changes in the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, we sure are, Wolf. Roth, as Jeff mentioned, a 5-term U.S. Senator, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, a powerful political figure. Roth IRAs, many people know that, named after him. Tom Carper, however, was also a very established figure, is an established figure, much younger, 54 years old, was the at-large congressman, a state treasurer, well-known figure. In fact, polls show that both men were highly regarded, but I have to mention, Wolf, that a year or two ago, there were a lot of Republican insiders who thought that maybe it'd be better if Senator Roth stepped aside. The Republicans nominated Mike Castle, a congressman, a former governor, that he would have a better chance of holding the seat. Roth didn't think so. They didn't.
All right, speaking of Delaware, we're ready to call the next governor of Delaware. Ruth Ann Minner, the Democrat, wins that open seat, defeating John Burris. And one important ballot initiative we're ready to call at this point right now in Michigan. There was a very controversial voucher initiative that would have allowed vouchers, money, government money, to go to private parochial schools. That voucher initiative in Michigan, we're now saying will go down to defeat no vouchers in Michigan. Tell us why that's important.
Well, the vouchers would have given students about $3,100 under current figures for students in schools that had a low graduation rate. Senator John McCain actually cut a TV ad for the pro-voucher people. The Michigan Catholic Conference was supportive of the Michigan Chamber, but of course the Michigan Education Association was strongly opposed, spent a lot of money against it. And these voucher initiatives have very, very big problems when they get in front of the voters, and they seem to go down, and this one went down as well.
And there's another voucher initiative in California. We'll watch for that, but for now, back to Bernie on the National Desk.
Also, CNN is calling the Senate race in New Jersey. Millionaire, multi-millionaire John Corzine, who spent more than $60 million, has won the open seat, turning back the challenge by Republican Bob Franks. Corzine, a big winner in New Jersey, having spent lots of money in the process.
That's a hold.
I was going to say, goes to show that for $55 or $60 million, you can buy your way into the United States Senate.
Well, in fact, it's most important in terms of the balance of power. That's Frank Lautenberg's seat, so we count that as a hold for the Democrats. But unlike Al Checkey in California or Michael Huffington in California, this enormous record-busting sum literally paid off.
We will be back later, though. We now go back to our election headquarters in Atlanta, where it's 9 o'clock in the east, and the polls are about to close in New York, Wisconsin, and New Mexico.
From CNN Center in Atlanta, coverage of Election 2000 continues. Here again, Judy Woodruff, Bernard Shaw, Jeff Greenfield, and Bill Schneider.
And indeed, those polls have closed, and the First Lady of the United States of America will become a senator from New York State. Hillary Rodham Clinton tonight defeating Congressman Rick Lazio.
I think it is safe to say, folks, that we have written a new page in American political history. Not only the First Lady ever to hold public office, someone who moved to New York, a state she had never lived in, someone who in February of 1999 or January watched her husband being acquitted of impeachment charges, and on that very day huddled with Harold Ickes, one of the Clintons' top aides, and started talking about her future, which included, amazingly to some people, a United States Senate seat in New York. One other thing, she got 2 huge breaks. That Rudy Giuliani had to, because of health and personal reasons, not run, and she got a huge break when George Bush became the Republican nominee, taking New York virtually out of the presidential battleground and dumping no Republican help in there. But to her credit, she went upstate, Republican territory, worked for a year and a half, and she is now the United States Senator-elect from New York, and who'd have thunk it a year and a half ago.
Who'd have thunk it?
I also think we should probably pause and talk one more second about that Hillary Clinton Senate race, because it is not just another Senate race. I have a very quick story. When Eleanor Roosevelt was a widow, Harold Ickes Sr. went to her in 1945 and urged her to run for the United States Senate from New York. Said, you will be a great tribute to your husband. Eleanor said, I can't do it. He's only been dead a month. I'm not ready to even think about it. So 54 years later, Harold Ickes' son sits with Hillary Rodham Clinton and says, if you come to New York and run for the Senate, we think you can make it. And she has.
And a prime factor has to be her husband, President Clinton, who not only whispered strategy in her ear, but campaigned tirelessly with her.
Yes. I think with this victory, Hillary Rodham Clinton instantly becomes a national figure, or she is a national figure already, but I think she becomes a national Democrat with a very wide national following. Now, if Al Gore wins the election, in a sense, you'll have 2 leading national Democrats, each of whom can claim the Clinton legacy. Al Gore, his selected vice president, and Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton, his wife. If there's ever a difference of opinion between, if he's president, Al Gore, and Senator Clinton, won't that be interesting?
Frank Buckley is in New York at Clinton headquarters. What's it like, Frank?
Well, the mood jubilant here, the crowd erupting in cheers as the TV reports of Hillary Clinton being declared the winner came out on the big screen TVs, the people here in the audience cheering. And to pick up on a thread that you were just talking about, yes, Mrs. Clinton did embrace the president in campaigning later on in the campaign. Early, she did not campaign with him very much. The thinking was that they wanted her to be able to establish herself as a candidate, and once she was able to do that, and once it was clear that the people of New York knew that she was running on her own, then they felt very comfortable in bringing the president in. The president's popularity never waning here in New York, so they felt that he was a strong card to bring to the table, and he in fact helped in the final days, especially in bringing out the Democratic base here in New York.
Deborah Fayrick is over at Rick Lazio's campaign.
Well, this is what you're seeing. You're seeing a live picture of the room right now. There was stunned silence when this race was called for Hillary Clinton. No reaction from any members of the crowd who had been cheering wildly every time a state was announced for Governor Bush. No reaction whatsoever. Several people looking visibly upset. One woman left the room. Now, Lazio, we spoke to a spokesperson from his campaign not more than 10 minutes ago, and they were adamant. They said that this thing is not over yet. They were really hoping to get a very big boost from voters between 5 and 7 o'clock, a time that they had deemed sort of Republican voting time. Rick Lazio was at Grand Central Station campaigning. It does not appear to have been enough. Right now, no comment, no reaction as to whether they're going to concede or when they will concede. Rick Lazio has always considered himself the underdog in this race. He was the underdog when he first won election back in 1992 to the House, and he was really hoping to repeat that with another come-from-behind victory. Judy, Bernie?
Bill Snyder, what was persuasive among the voters?
Well, let's look at the voters of New York. To whom does Hillary Rodham Clinton owe a debt of gratitude? And the answer is whom? Women. Women voted 58% for Hillary Rodham Clinton, almost 60%. Phenomenal. Men didn't vote for her. Men voted very narrowly for Rick Lazio. And let me point out that Gore won New York by carrying both men and women, but in Hillary's case, it was women who put her over. What about the carpetbagger issue? We asked voters in New York, has she lived long enough in New York to represent New York effectively? And on the carpetbagger issue, New York voters were split. 50% said they were not concerned that she hasn't lived there long enough. Almost 50% said, yeah, it was an issue of concern. So the carpetbagger issue did not go overwhelmingly against Hillary Rodham Clinton in her effort to become senator from New York. Of course, we know the only other time when someone won a Senate race who had never lived or worked in a state was Robert Kennedy in 1964, also in New York.
68. This has been a real roller coaster of a race, of a campaign for this woman, you have to say. I mean, she started out, she thought she was running against Rudy Giuliani, and of course we know because of health problems he ended up dropping out. But I mean, it's been up, it's been down, it's been all over the place, and she's taken a lot.
The remarkable thing about this race was that even more than most presidential races, the passions that this race engendered in my home state were astonishing. You heard opinions about Hillary Clinton that were on the one hand, you know, this was a role model, and on the other hand were scabrous. And at first, a lot of traditional Democratic liberals, including women, were very hostile to her. They said she's coming up here because she couldn't deal with her husband. I mean, it was pretty rough, and I do think in part of it was that the Democrats came home on issues. But the other thing was she worked her head off.
Her head off.
Her head.
But how many people were neutral about Hillary Clinton this year? Everyone went into this with a strong feeling one way or another. And what you're saying is that strong feelings against were shifted to some extent.
If I may, just one quick thing. I think that even the people who were undecided emotionally. They really had problems with her personally. They had problems with the relationship, and they were really had problems if they were Democrats with giving another Republican vote to Trent Lott. I mean, those issues, things I think helped.
That's right. I think it's fair to say that the race was about Hillary. It was not about Rick Lazio, about whom most New Yorkers did not have strong opinions. If men didn't vote for Hillary, it's because they had strong opinions about her, not because they were voting for a man.
All right, Hillary Clinton will be going to the United States Senate, and our man who's keeping an eye on the Senate and the House and the governors tonight is Wolf Blitzer. Let's go straight to you, Wolf.
Well, Judy, let's take a look at what's happening in the U.S. Senate. First of all, with this pickup in Minnesota, Mark Dayton defeating the incumbent Rod Grams. Right now, the Republican holdovers, 35 Democratic holdovers 31. As of right now, there have been 12 Republicans who have been elected, 13 Democrats. That suggests that there's still only a few races left to go before the final outcome is determined. Let's go to some of those races that we can now call. 9 undecided Senate races, by the way, we're still waiting for. In Wisconsin, Herb Kohl, the incumbent, has defeated John Gillespie, the Republican. In Arizona, John Kyle, he had no Democratic opponent, easily winning in the Arizona re-election. In New Mexico, Jeff Bingaman, the incumbent Democrat, re-elected, defeating Bill Redmond. In Rhode Island, Lincoln Chafee, the Republican incumbent appointed, has been re-elected, defeating Bob Wagand. In North Dakota, Kent Conrad, the Democratic incumbent, he has been re-elected. In Wyoming, Senator Craig Thomas, he has been re-elected. Stuart Rothenberg, so far in all of these Senate races, including Mrs. Clinton's in New York State, they seem to be going as the polls, the final poll numbers had suggested.
I think you're right, Wolf. I think so far things have been predictable. The biggest problem for the Democrats is the defeat of Chuck Robb. If they had held on to that seat, they would have had some leeway in picking up these other Republican seats that are yet to come, Michigan and Missouri and the like. They're going to need wins in most of those states. The one race I think that's notable that you just mentioned was Rhode Island, a state that went for Al Gore for president. It was held by Lincoln Chafee. He was appointed to the seat after his father passed away. It's a Democratic state, but he held it as a Republican.
Even incumbency for a short term has its advantages. Let's take a look at some of the gubernatorial races. Governor Jeanne Shaheen has won her bid to be reelected in New Hampshire. That was too close to call earlier in the evening. And in North Dakota, John Hoeven, the Republican, defeating Heidi Heitkamp. A lot of people had watched that race in North Dakota.
You're right. That was regarded as a toss-up. The Republican governor decided not to seek re-election. She has had medical problems. Some question would evoke some sympathy. But Hoeven, the Republican, in a Republican state, eked out a win.
2 ballot initiatives also we're now ready to say in Colorado, both of these statewide ballot initiatives. Colorado passed the gun control initiative that does now require background checks at gun shows. Also, Colorado passed the medical marijuana initiative that allows marijuana to be used for medical purposes in the state of Colorado.
Well, Wolf, these ballot measures give the voters a clean shot at issues. Unlike candidate races where there are lots of issues involved and there's personalities as well, these are very focused on issues.
And Stuart, we're also monitoring all of the 435 races in the House of Representatives, all up for grabs right now. About 25% of those races have been determined, and what we're seeing is so far no pickups for the Democrats or the Republicans.
Wolf, very few House races were in play this year. There haven't been any turnovers yet. It won't take very many to get the Democrats to creep up toward a majority. There is a barn burner going on in Florida's 8th Congressional District in Orlando based, a Republican open seat, where at the moment the Republican Rick Keller has a very narrow 1,000 vote advantage with over 90% of the votes cast. That's the race we're looking at right now.
And that's the seat that Bill McCollum gave up. He ran unsuccessfully for the U.S. Senate as a Republican, former House impeachment manager. Stuart Rothenberg, thank you. Back to the National Desk.
Okay, thanks very much, Wolf. An observation about Mrs. Clinton's win in New York State. It seems to me she's paraphrasing a famous line from Vice President Gore's convention acceptance speech in Los Angeles. I am my own woman, against the backdrop of her problems with her husband.
Well, when you think that it was the day her husband had such huge troubles of his own that she announced that she was striking out on her own, I think that leads you to draw that conclusion.
Yeah, a lot of people admired her. Some criticized her, of course, for sticking with her husband and standing by him in all of his ordeal. I think most of the people who voted for her were Clinton supporters, but some might have said, you know, we're going to vote for her as a statement.
I've just been told that there's already a Wire story moving, and I'm sorry I can't credit the Wire service, that there's word that Hillary Clinton will likely serve on the Senate Health, Labor, and Education Committee. That's a Senate committee that Senator Edward Kennedy has long been associated with. I think he's the ranking Democrat there.
I mean, it's a nice irony. She is her own person now. I think it's fair to say that she got where she got, A, because she was First Lady of the United States. Second, a figure who was often seen in harsh terms, especially after the health care debacle, who was seen as a figure of sympathy because of what her husband put her through. And also succeeded in New York in part because Bill Clinton that is the state where he is probably as popular and even personally, despite everything, as any state in the country. So it's an interesting transition. She's her own person who got where she is because she was married to her husband and then used that to go beyond that. Fascinating story.
Very fascinating. Well, there in Washington, and we're going to check in with our man Wolf Blitzer, who will give us a little bit about an idea of how things look in the balance of power on the Hill right now. Wolf?
Bernie, we've been spending a lot of time talking about the Senate, sometime about the governors. We now have the first pickup in the House of Representatives. The Democrat Brad Carson defeating Andy Ewing. This is a seat that was given up because Representative Tom Coburn, the Republican, was retiring. A Democrat has now picked up that seat in Oklahoma. In Connecticut, look at this. Representative Sam Gadenson is trailing the Republican Robert Simmons. Gadenson, 20-year veteran in the U.S. Senate, the ranking Democrat on the House International Relations Committee. In Pennsylvania, a very close race between Melissa Hart and Terry Van Horn. The Democrat and the Republican were in a bitter battle, very close right now, still very tight. We can't call this race. Let's come back to that later, but for now, let's go back to Judy on the National Desk.
Yes. Gentlemen, we need to get over to the Balance of Power desk to hear some about those very important non-presidential races. Wolf.
Judy, let's take a look, first of all, what's happening in the U.S. Senate. As you know, the Republicans had a 54-46 majority. Right now, this is what it looks like. 35 Republican holdovers, 31 Democratic holdovers, 14 Republican wins tonight, 13 Democratic wins tonight. Right now, the new total, let's take a look at what we can project. It will be 49 Republicans in the U.S. Senate as of right now, 44 Democrats, 7 of those Senate seats still undecided. We can call Orrin Hatch, the Republican from Utah, the winner, the former presidential candidate for the Republican nomination. He won. There's a very close race going on right now in Missouri. Senator John Ashcroft, the incumbent, facing Mel Carnahan, the governor who passed away in a plane crash only a couple of weeks ago. Very close race. There was a controversy a little while ago, earlier this evening. A lower court judge in Missouri kept the polls open for a while. They were subsequently closed by a state appeals judge. But the incumbent Republican, Kit Bond, speaking out in Missouri earlier, lamented that decision to keep the polls open a bit longer. Listen to this.
So the Democratic Party in the city of St. Louis wants to perpetrate the biggest fraud on the voters of this state and on this nation that we've ever seen. I believe that criminal vote fraud should be prosecuted by the federal government.
Senator Kit Bond speaking out earlier on that decision to keep the polls open for a while in Missouri. Let's take a look at what the pickups are in the U.S. Senate as of right now. In Florida, Bill Nelson, the Democrat, has won. In Delaware, Tom Carper, the governor, has won the Senate seat. In Minnesota, Mark Dayton, the Democrat, has won. That is a pickup as well. There are 2 Republican pickups in the U.S. Senate. George Allen, the winner in Virginia, and John Ensign, here we go, the winner in Nevada, beating Ed Bernstein, a criminal defense attorney. That's the open seat. Richard Bryan left vacant. Stuart Rothenberg, what do you make of this battle going on in the Senate right now?
Well, Wolf, everything is actually going as expected so far. There are actually 5 competitive seats outstanding, 4 of them currently held by Republicans: Missouri, Michigan, Montana, and Washington. 1 of them held by a Democrat, actually a retiring Democrat in Nebraska. If the Democrats are going to take control of the U.S. Senate, they're going to need to sweep all these races. That's going to be difficult.
There is a fierce battle going on in the House of Representatives as well. We do have a second pickup that we can report right now. The state senator Melissa Hart defeating State Representative Terry Van Horn, the Democrat. That's the seat that Ron Klink gave up, the Democrat, in order to run unsuccessfully for the U.S. Senate in Pennsylvania. Let's take a look at the balance of power in the House with more than 50% now, half of the House races determined. We only have 2 pickups right now, 1 Democratic pickup, 1 Republican pickup. This is as expected as well, right, Stuart?
Absolutely, Wolf. There are a number of Republican vulnerable seats that are now off the table. Rick Keller has won in that Orlando district. 2 Republican incumbents in North Carolina, Charles Taylor and Robin Hayes, held on. But so many close seats. In New Jersey, Mike Ferguson leads Marianne Connolly by 1,900 votes with 45% in. Pat Casey, a Democrat, a narrow lead over Don Sherwood in the Scranton Congressional District. Dick Zimmer, former congressman, has a narrow lead now, just pulled ahead in a narrow lead against Rush Holt in a New Jersey district. I could go on and on, but we don't have enough time, but there are a lot of very close races.
And we also are following the governor races. We can report right now in the state of Utah, Mike Leavitt defeating Bill Orton. Not a huge surprise. Mike Leavitt, the Republican in Utah. The races for the governorships are not all that surprising either, are they, Stuart?
No, I think actually they're less exciting than the congressional races where you're really talking about control of a branch of the federal government. But to the people in those individual states, they're pretty important.
And so just to button this up, the prospects of the Democrats regaining the majority in the House and in the Senate right now as we speak at 10:45 or so Eastern Time.
Well, it's still uncertain. There are just too many races out. But the Democrats need to make some gains over the next hour or two because when they get to the West Coast, that's their best opportunities. But they're going to probably need to be in plus territory by the time we get to Utah, Washington, California, where they should make some real gains.
And in California, they are expecting some pickups, Democrats in California.
Right. They have a chance to pick up 3 or 4 seats, one in Washington, one in Utah. So the way these early races are playing out is not disastrous for them, but they're not quite getting the breaks they had hoped to get.
All right, Stuart Rothenberg, I want to go back to Bernie on the national desk. Bernie?
We're going to check in now in New York State. Earlier, we declared Hillary Rodham Clinton the winner in New York Senate race. Let's check in there at Lazio headquarters, listen to what's going on. Deborah Fayerick is there also. Deborah, what's the latest?
Hi there. Sorry, Bernie. As you can see, a big roar went up in this crowd. You would think that Lazio won. New York is playing. There are happy, smiling faces. There's a general enthusiasm here. Even Rick Lazio and his wife, unflappable. That smile that you saw throughout the campaign. He's waving to his fans. He's waving to the crowd. He's there standing with Mayor Giuliani, as well as New York Governor George Pataki. Lazio knew he was the underdog going into this race. The GOP leaders had asked him to step aside. He had wanted to get into this race much earlier, but you can see the man standing there to the right. Mayor Giuliani was the bigger political celebrity. And so Lazio didn't get into this race until 5.5 months ago. I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm sure you can hear what's going on behind me.
Well, we can hear you. We don't know how much of a voice you're going to have in about 2 hours, but Deborah Fayerick in New York at Congressman Rick Lazio's headquarters. Earlier, CNN declared Hillary Rodham Clinton will become a senator from New York.
Location. Live pictures from New York City, where Hillary Rodham Clinton celebrating with a few hundred of her closest friends. Up there, a very happy First Lady this night. We don't see the president on the stage with her, but we do see the retiring Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, whose seat she has evidently, yes, there is the president, whose seat she's been elected to, at least by our call. Their daughter, Chelsea.
Chuck Schumer. Senator Chuck Schumer with her, who she helped a lot 2 years ago, and he helped her this time out. He will now be the lesser-known senator, I think it's fair to say, from the state of New York.
And we know that not very far away from this place, Congressman Rick Lazio is speaking to his supporters. We haven't been able to hear what he is saying, but we do know that he is addressing a crowd at his headquarters elsewhere in New York City. This has to be a sweet, sweet night for Hillary Rodham Clinton.
And we should say that Daniel Patrick Moynihan, retiring after 24 years in the Senate, helped ease Mrs. Clinton's path to New York by introducing her when she came up to New York on her exploratory tour. There's Senator Schumer, who beat Al D'Amato 2 years ago.
And he predicted many, many months ago that Hillary Rodham Clinton would win.
This is a great night, and I know.
We're going to move over now to the headquarters, or rather the hotel headquarters of Rick Lazio. Listen to what the congressman is saying.
I want to thank the campaign manager who worked so hard. He almost ended up in a hospital. Bill Dalco worked his heart out for this thing. Thank you, Bill. I I want to thank two great leaders in our state. The first man who got into this race and worked hard throughout the campaign over these last few days, has knocked himself out. He's been a terrific friend to me. He's been an outstanding public servant and maybe the greatest governor our state has ever known, George Pataki. Thank you, George Pataki. And Libby as well. I'd like to thank also another great public servant, somebody who went to bat for me, worked very hard, up until the last possible event right before the polls closed, and that's our great mayor, again, one of the greatest mayors, Rudy Giuliani. Thank you. I want to thank a man who stood up for me last year, a man who stood on principle, a guy who has, I love you too, who's a dear, dear friend of mine, who has impeccable integrity, whose word you can count on, and there's not a whole lot of folks in public service you can say that about, unfortunately, and that's our great conservative chairman, Mike Long. Thank you, Mike. And I want to thank our Republican Chairman, Bill Powers, for working so hard. Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Congressman Tom Reynolds, who chaired my committee, who is, I know, back up in Buffalo, worked incredibly hard. My great friend, Rob Portman, who many of you saw on the campaign trail. Congressman Amo Houghton. My brother-in-law, Mike Moriarty, for his hard work. Thank you. And finally, the person who was my strongest supporter, my friend, the person who probably should have been the candidate for Senate.
All right, we are going to move all the way from the west coast of the United States all the way over to the east coast of the United States, where this woman has made history tonight by being elected to the United States Senate, a first lady. Let's listen to Hillary Rodham Clinton.
I mean, wow, this is amazing. Thank you all. Thank you. You know, we started this great effort on a sunny July morning in Pinder's Corner on Pat and Liz Moynihan's beautiful farm. And 62 counties, 16 months, 3 debates, 2 opponents, and 6 black pantsuits later, because of you, here we are. You came out and said that issues and ideals matter. Jobs matter, downstate and upstate. Health care matters, education matters, the environment matters, Social Security matters, a woman's right to choose matters. It all matters, and I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you, New York. Thank you for opening up your minds and your hearts, for seeing the possibility of what we could do together for our children and for our future here in this state and in our nation. I am profoundly grateful to all of you for giving me the chance to serve you. I will do everything I can to be worthy of your faith and trust and to honor the powerful example of Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. I would like all of you and the countless New Yorkers and Americans watching to join me in honoring him for his incredible half-century of service to New York and our nation. Senator Moynihan, on behalf of New York and America, thank you. And I thank Chuck Schumer for his generous support and friendship. He has been and will be a great champion for the people of New York, and I very much look forward to fighting by his side in the United States Senate. I want to thank both of my opponents, Mayor Giuliani and Congressman Lazio. Congressman Lazio and I just spoke. I congratulate him on a hard-fought race, and I thank him for his service to the people of New York and Long Island, and I wish him, Pat, and their two beautiful daughters well. I promise you tonight that I will reach across party lines to bring progress for all of New York's families. Today we voted as Democrats and Republicans. Tomorrow we begin again as New Yorkers. And how fortunate we are indeed to live in the most diverse, dynamic, and beautiful state in the entire Union. You know, from the South Bronx to the Southern Tier, from Brooklyn to Buffalo, from Montauk to Messina, from the world's tallest skyscrapers to breathtaking mountain ranges, I've met people whose faces and stories I will never forget. Thousands of New Yorkers from all 62 counties welcomed me into your schools, your local diners, your factory floors, your living rooms, and front porches. You taught me, you tested me, and you shared with me your challenges and concerns about overcrowded or crumbling schools, about the struggle to care for growing children and aging parents, about the continuing challenge of providing equal opportunity for all, and about children moving away from their hometowns because good jobs are so hard to find in upstate New York. Now, I've worked on issues like these for a long time, some of them for 30 years, and I am determined to make a difference for all of you. You see, I believe our nation owes every responsible citizen and every responsible family the tools that they need to make the most of their own lives. That's the basic bargain I'll do my best to honor in the United States Senate. And to those of you who did not support me, I want you to know that I will work in the Senate for you and for all New Yorkers. And to those of you who worked so hard and never lost faith, even in the toughest times, I offer you my undying gratitude. I will work my heart out for you for the next 6 years, and I wouldn't be here if it weren't for the steady support of so many people. I want to thank Charlie Rangel, Nita Lowey, and the entire New York Democratic Congressional Delegation, my future colleagues. I'm very grateful for the support of our Democratic statewide elected officials and my good friends Carl McCall and Elliot Spitzer. I want to thank Shelley Silver and all the Democratic Assembly members, and Marty Connor and all the Democratic members of the state Senate. I want to thank all of my upstate friends who couldn't be here tonight, including Tony Masiello, Bill Johnson, Jerry Jennings, Mike Breslin, Mark Thomas, all the county chairs and other elected officials. And thank you to all of my downstate friends, Andy Spano and the county chairs and all the elected officials, and particularly my friends right here in New York City, the citywide officials, the borough presidents, the city council members, and two great friends, former mayors Ed Koch and David Dinkins.
Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton, having made history by being the first Lady elected to a major office, the United States Senate. Let's take a look now at the numbers. 66% of the precincts reporting, and I didn't call out the numbers.
This is the key, I think, one of the keys, Judy, that in the presidential race, Al Gore is running, even now, 1 million votes ahead of George Bush. She was running about 500,000 votes ahead of Rick Lazio.
60% there for Gore and 35% for Bush. I was talking and couldn't digest the numbers that we just showed in the Senate race.
Well, can we see them again?
Here they are. This is the
numbers.
Gore-Bush race where he's running at least 1 million votes ahead with 2/3 of the precincts in, and Hillary has about a margin of 500,000 so far. This should remind a lot of people of the last out-of-stater who came to New York and won, Robert Kennedy in 1964, who won by 750,000 votes, while Lyndon Johnson was beating Barry Goldwater by more than 2.5 million votes. These are two races, then and now, where coattails may have helped.
All right, there are the Senate numbers again with 68% of the precincts reporting Hillary Clinton, 56% of the vote to Lazio's 44. As Jeff said, it's about a 500,000 vote margin for the First Lady.
Yeah, which suggests that not only did she choose a good state to run in, because New York has 2 million more Democrats registered than Republicans, but she chose a good year to run. In a presidential year, where a candidate like Al Gore can pile up a big majority, she does have coattails to ride. If this weren't a presidential year, she might have had a much tougher time winning New York.
But that's a pretty significant margin. I mean, who knows whether it will hold, but this is 2/3 of the precincts reporting, and she's got a 12 percentage point margin.
Money, money, money. More than $21 million spent.
That's right.
Yes, but barely, that's about 1/3 as much as was spent by one candidate in New Jersey. Often New Jersey is said to have an inferiority complex. When it comes to spending money in a U.S. Senate race, boy, New Jersey can hold its head up high, and state of New York, you guys are minor leaguers compared to what we did.
That's John Corzine.
John Corzine, because New Jersey has two of the most expensive media markets in the country. To run in New Jersey, you have to advertise in New York and you have to advertise in Philadelphia. Those are expensive markets, and John Corzine spent about $60 million, more than any candidate in history, to win that Senate seat.
We should repeat a news item that we reported several hours ago. Libby Pataki, wife of the governor, went on radio earlier today.
We're watching the presidential race. We're also watching a number of Senate, House, and governor races. Very important. Let's go right to our balance of power man tonight, Wolf Blitzer.
Judy, a very close race in Washington State right now. The incumbent senator, the Republican Slade Gorton, and the former Congresswoman Maria Cantwell. Too close to call. That race we're going to be counting votes on to see who wins. Let's take a look at the balance of power in the Senate as of this minute. What we know, there were 35 Republican holdovers, 31 Democratic holdovers. The Republicans so far tonight have won 14 states. The Democrats have won 15 states. That brings the total, the Republican total right now, 49 Republican senators, 46 Democratic senators, 5 still undecided, those undecided being Michigan, Missouri, Nebraska, Montana, and Washington State. Stuart Rothenberg, so far one pickup for the Democrats. tonight.
Well, a lot of the close contests are still out there, Wolf, but the Democrats have to go 5 for 5, and 4 of them would be takeovers. That's awfully difficult. And our viewers might be wondering about the presidential level in the Senate. As you know, as we noted, Missouri went for Governor Bush at the presidential level, but John Ashcroft is trailing him slightly, and Michigan, of course, is going for Al Gore. Spencer Abraham is actually drawing a few more votes than George Bush did in that state.
All right, we'll be watching those 5 states. For now, back to Bernie on the national desk.
Wolf Blitzer, race is underway in the House. What's the latest?
We're taking a close look at the House races. There's one net pickup we can report right now in Long Island. Felix Grucci, the Republican, beating Regina Seltzer. This was the seat that Michael Forbes lost in the Democratic primary. He's the former Republican who turned Democratic. Let's take a look at what we can report on the balance of power in the House of Representatives right now. Very, very close so far. If you take a look at all the numbers, they're still undecided, and there's still about only about 3/4 of the seats have been determined right now. So far, we can say the Republicans have a net gain of 2 seats. We're still waiting, Stuart Rothenberg, for some seats out of the West Coast, though.
Not just the West Coast, Wolf. We've got 2 squeakers in Jersey, 1 in West Virginia, 1 in Scranton, 1 in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where Heather Wilson is in trouble. All across the country, we've got a lot of close ones.
We're going to be watching all of those races right now. Back to the national desk.
If we have an important call, we understand. Thanks to Ann Richards, Howard Baker, and Bob Wood. We may be coming back, we may not, but we have an important call. Let's go to Judy.
All right, Larry, this is not a call in the presidential race. It is a very important call, and that is CNN is saying that the United States House of Representatives will remain in Republican hands. The Republicans will retain control of the House. Let's go right to Wolf Blitzer over at the Balance of Power arena. Wolf.
Judy, the Democrats needed to gain at least 7 seats, net seats, in the House of Representatives in order to become the majority, in order to allow Dick Gephardt, the congressman from Missouri, to be the next Speaker of the House of Representatives. That has not happened. Stuart Rothenberg, tell us what's going on in the House of Representatives, why the Republicans are expected now to retain the majority.
Well, Wolf, overall, we have not that many seats that changed hands one way or the other, and the Republicans did surprisingly well in the East, enough to offset any late Democratic advantage in the West. So, for example, the Republicans picked up a seat in New York in the 1st Congressional District, in Western Pennsylvania in the 4th. It looks like a surprise win in Eastern Connecticut in the 2nd Congressional District, where Sam Gadenson may well go down. It looks like he has gone down. In New Jersey, it looks like Dick Zimmer has won that seat over Rush Holt. Zimmer, a former congressman, has come back to retake it from Holt in a close race. Congresswoman Pat Danner, a Democrat, retired in Missouri. Her son was unable to hold a seat for the Democrats. It looks like Republican Sam Graves has won it. And on the other hand, the Democrats just didn't pick up enough Republican seats. They picked up a district, Rick Lazio's district on Long Island, Suffolk County, the 2nd Congressional District, where the Republicans nominated an African-American woman. She lost. That's a Democratic pickup. And in Oklahoma's 2nd Congressional District, which we mentioned a while ago, at least it seems like days ago, doesn't it, Wolf? Other than that, a seat in New Mexico possibly, and some in California in the West, but just not enough takeaways by the Democrats.
And as a result of all of this, Dennis Hastert of Illinois will remain the Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Well, that's for the Republican conference to decide, but absolutely, yes, the Republicans are going to keep control of the House of Representatives. They might have an additional seat or 2. They might be down 2 or 3. We can't know quite yet. We're waiting for the West Coast to come in, but they're going to hold.
We've been waiting for an important race in the U.S. Senate. CNN can now call a winner in Washington State. Maria Cantwell, a major executive of the high-tech industry, defeating the Republican incumbent Senator Slade Gorton. This is not a huge surprise, but it does represent a net gain, of course, for the Democrats.
Absolutely, and it's actually the 2nd time Slade Gorton has been defeated as an incumbent in a bid for re-election. Happened a number of years ago as well. The Democrats always thought they had a good chance here, but it was interesting. Both parties had very different polling. The Republicans were pretty sure that Slade Gorton was ahead and would win. The Democrats thought the same about Maria Cantwell. I guess the Democratic polling was better, and they were right.
So right now, as of now, the balance of power in the Senate, 49 Republicans, 47 Democrats, 4 seats in the U.S. Senate still up for grabs. Those seats are from Missouri, Michigan, Nebraska, and Montana. How do those states look right now, Stuart?
Well, again, if the Democrats have to get a sweep here, Montana is a particularly difficult race for them because it is a generally conservative and Republican state. That's a tough nut to crack. But right now in Michigan and Missouri, it's hard to tell. The Republicans could go 3 for 3, or the Democrats could go 3 for 3.
And that Missouri seat is especially interesting, almost unprecedented.
It's quite tight. It's a close race. Yeah, nobody knows exactly what to make of it, given the unusual circumstances. Ashcroft has been holding a narrow lead throughout the evening, but it's awfully close.
All right, let's take a look at the Senate balance of power, where it stands right now. There were, going into tonight, 35 Republican holdovers, 31 Democratic holdovers. So far, one tonight, 14 Republicans have been elected, 16 Democrats have been elected. As a result, the new total is this: 49 Republicans, 47 Democrats, 4 undecided seats. Those 4 undecided seats, once again, Missouri, John Ashcroft, the incumbent, against the late Mel Carnahan, the governor. In Michigan, Spencer Abraham against Debbie Stabenow. In Montana, Conrad Burns and Brian Schweitzer, still up in the air. And in Nebraska, Ben Nelson and Don Stenberg. That race in Nebraska has been an exciting race. Normally, Republicans seem to be the power in Nebraska, but the Democrat in this particular case, Ben Nelson, he's still in the running.
Absolutely, but I think the reason Stenberg is doing so well is it's the Republicanism of the state in a presidential year. Republican insiders in Washington have actually been rather pessimistic about that race. Nelson, a former governor, was popular, lost to Chuck Hagel, you may remember a few years ago, has come back now. He's no longer a governor. He can run as a moderate Democrat. It's a difficult race for the Republicans, but I think there are a lot of Stenberg people that are shaking their finger at me and say, aha, we told you so. We told you this was going to be a close race, but I don't know whether he can win.
And let's take another close look at Montana. It's normally a Republican state. Conrad Burns, the incumbent Republican senator, facing a stiff challenge from Brian Schweitzer, a rancher. That race still too close to call.
Right, and Schweitzer, of course, used the issue of prescription drugs to his advantage early on to get a lot of earned media coverage, what we call free media, redefine this race. Burns was rather slow to respond, and I think Republicans are nervous about the seat. In the last few days, Republicans thought that their polling showed Conrad Burns with a slight uptick and were somewhat more hopeful.
All right, and we have a new race to call now in Vermont. We've been waiting a long time. The CNN can now call Governor Howard Dean, the incumbent, the winner, beating Ruth Dwyer in what was a very, very close race. Howard Dean had signed into law in Vermont what's called the same-sex marriage provision, yet he went on to be reelected.
Well, this was a three-way race, and the real question was whether Howard Dean was going to get the 50% of the vote that he needed, according to state law, to be reelected, or whether the race would be thrown to the state legislature. As you mentioned, this civil unions issue was quite controversial. The governor had been popular outside of that issue and apparently was able to hang on.
So there's basically, as we're looking at the Senate, the House, the governor's races, no huge surprises, but there's still some doubt as far as the U.S. Senate is concerned. The House of Representatives will remain in a Republican majority. The Senate still up for grabs.
The one thing we can say, Wolf, there has not been a major sea change in American politics in the House of the Senate.
All right, Stuart Rothenberg, thank you. Now back to the desk.
All right, well, Blitzer, the one other observation I would make about the Senate is that as of now, there will be 2 more women in the United States Senate. Right now, there are 9 women serving, with the addition of Hillary Rodham Clinton from the state of New York, Maria Cantwell all the way across the country in the state of Washington. There will be 11, and potentially, if we don't know how Michigan's going to turn out, but we still have Debbie Stabenow running against the incumbent Spence Abraham.
And my observation would be to remind everyone what Trent Lott, the Senate Majority Leader, said here in an interview on CNN a short while ago. He really doubts that the Democrats are going to go 5 up tonight in the Senate.
One other thing. If the Democrats pick up 3 of these 4 seats that are out, it becomes 50-50, and if Joe Lieberman and Al Gore do win the White House, Joe Lieberman's decision to run for the Senate and not cede the seat to a Democrat who would almost certainly have won will cost the Democrats control of the United States Senate. Yeah. I cannot remember any election where so many things turned on one thin dime.
Is there any question if Joe Lieberman had given up that seat that the Democrats would have retained?
Attorney General Blumenthal was they actually did some polling on this, would have been an easy victor over anyone the Republicans had put out. Yeah. And I think, you know, if Joe Lieberman becomes vice president, becomes president of the Senate, the first thing he'll face is a fairly angry minority of Democrats who said, thanks a whole lot for costing us control of the Senate.
Yeah, and what Stu just said, if the Congress does remain in Republican hands, the House is in Republican hands, the Senate odds are slightly in that favor. then that's really a vote for the status quo. Democrats thought they had a chance to break through. He said there was no sea change in that. It'll be interesting, however, if you have a Republican president, if George Bush wins, and a Republican Congress, this would be the first time the Republicans control everything since 1954. And I think a lot of Republicans would be overcome with excitement, irrational exuberance, and they might overinterpret their mandate if that's the outcome tonight.
Would it be so irrational?
I think it would be, given the closeness. I think the vote for Republican Congress is probably a vote for the status quo, and the vote for George Bush, if he wins, would not exactly be a sweeping mandate.
Well, just to point out, when the Republicans took the Congress in 1994, and some would argue they overreached and perhaps thought they had more of a mandate than they did, they handed a big club to Bill Clinton, and I think we even heard in what Speaker Hastert and Majority Leader Trent Lott have said is a cautionary tale to the more ideological Republicans to say, look, you know, this is obviously going to be a very close, evenly divided government. Whatever happens, let's take it easy.
And the guy who would have the job of doing that would be, if he's elected, President Bush, who would then be able to say, he'd have to say, I control the agenda and I was not elected to create a conservative revolution in the country, because he wasn't.
And in fact, that's exactly what Karl Rove said to me. I had a conversation with him earlier today about this very thing, and that's one of the things he said. He said if we have a Republican House and a Republican Senate, he said we by no means assume that, you know, we can get what we want. We're going to have to work with both
And quickly,
parties.
if Al Gore wins and the Republican Congress is reelected, that really does look like a vote for the status quo in very good times.
All right.
And you have to consider the influence of Christian conservatives tonight in this vote.
All right, we are.
And what they did.
Yeah, well, they mobilized a lot of voters for Governor Bush in some key states, like maybe Iowa.
Well,
yes.
Let's hold off on the Clinton factor for just a second and say that CNN is making a call in West Virginia. The challenger, Bob Wise, has unseated Governor Cecil Underwood. That's in West Virginia. Jeff, the Clinton factor you were saying.
Well, I'm asking Bill, if seniors are not voting on prescription drugs and Social Security as much as the Gore campaign would have liked, could it be that for seniors, the personal misbehavior of President Clinton is more of a factor than in, say, other age groups?
Well, that's exactly what we found in 1998. Remember, when Republicans held on to Congress, most of the reason why they held on to Congress was because of older women, senior women, who appear to have been dismayed by Clinton's behavior in the Monica Lewinsky affair, the fact that they disapproved of his values, and that drew a lot of them to vote Republican for Congress and save the Republican Congress. In this case, they may be voting for George Bush, that's senior women, for the same reason.
We're going to go directly to St. Louis, Missouri, to the man who would like to have been Speaker of the House of Representatives. Let's listen.
All of the people here and some not here who helped me win this campaign. I want to thank every worker. I want to especially thank Joyce Abusi, who's the best political director in the entire world. And I want to thank every one of you who helped me, who went door to door with us, who helped us make telephone calls, who took us to the picnics, who helped us talk to the people about the issues that matter to the people in this district. And I will work every day to help the people of the 3rd District of Missouri.
Dick Gephardt, the minority leader of the House of Representatives, re-elected to another term in the U.S. Congress, 2-year term. As I mentioned a moment ago, he would have liked to have been have an additional title there to be Speaker of the House, but as CNN is projecting, we've said this earlier, we think the House will remain in Republican control. We want to go right now to our balance of power area over there across the newsroom, to CNN's Wolf Blitzer for an update. Wolf.
Judy, you want to take a look at the U.S. Senate right now to see where that balance of power in the Senate is stacking up. In the U.S. Senate, there were 35 Republican holdovers, 31 Democrats. The Republicans have won 14 seats. The Democrats tonight have won 16 seats. That brings the total to what we know right now, 49 seats for the Republican, 47 seats for the Democrats. 4 seats are still undecided. The Democrats would have to win all 4 of those seats in order to become the majority in the Senate. Let's take a look and see how close those 4 seats are. In Missouri, right now, Mel Carnahan, who died in a plane crash 2 or 3 weeks ago, he is getting 51% of the vote to Senator John Ashcroft, the Republican incumbent, 49%. But look at that actual vote total, very close. In Michigan right now, the incumbent Republican Spencer Abraham, 51% to Debbie Stabenow, the Democratic challenger. But look at that number, still very close with only 68% of the voters tallied so far. In Nebraska, the open seat, Bob Kerrey vacated that seat. The Democrat, Ben Nelson, is slightly ahead of Don Stenberg, the Republican. But look at the number, with 82% reporting, very, very close. Only 6,000 votes or so making a difference in Nebraska so far. In Montana, Conrad Burns slightly ahead of the challenger, Brian Schweitzer, the Democrat. Once again, only 62% of that number is there. Let's talk to Stuart Rothenberg and see what's happening with those 4 Senate seats.
Well, Wolf, obviously these are just too close to call. It's amazing the narrow margins given the considerable votes already cast. Clearly, somebody like Conrad Burns is in better position. He's an incumbent. It's a conservative state. But none of these races look locked up at the moment.
It's going to be a long night for a lot of these races. They're going to be looking at absentee ballots. They're going to be looking at every precinct.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm sure you're going to have the legal teams flying out of there from the Democratic Senate Committee and the Republican Senate Committee to make sure they're checking with ballot security and recounts and soiled ballots, things like that. So I think, you know, some of these races could drag on indefinitely. And I just would add, Wolf, it's not just these races. I was noticing a couple of the House races. I had referred to a New Jersey race, Dick Zimmer against Rush Holt, and my computer showed 100% of the vote in, and I looked a few minutes later and saw 100% of the vote in still, in a slightly different result. The latest result actually has Rush Holt ahead of Dick Zimmer by 56 votes. I don't know if that's a final or just a preliminary final.
Although we will recap, we are projecting that the Republicans will maintain the majority in the House of Representatives. Back to Judy on the National Desk.
We want to go right now to our balance of power area over there across the newsroom to CNN's Wolf Blitzer for an update. Wolf.
Judy, we want to take a look at the U.S. Senate right now to see where that balance of power in the Senate is stacking up. In the U.S. Senate, there were 35 Republican holdovers, 31 Democrats. The Republicans have won 14 seats. The Democrats tonight have won 16 seats. That brings the total to what we know right now, 49 seats for the Republican, 47 seats for the Democrats. 4 seats are still undecided. The Democrats would have to win all 4 of those seats in order to become the majority in the Senate. Let's take a look and see how close those 4 seats are. In Missouri, right now, Mel Carnahan, who died in a plane crash 2 or 3 weeks ago, he is getting 51% of the vote to Senator John Ashcroft, the Republican incumbent, 49%. But look at that actual vote total, very close. In Michigan right now, the incumbent Republican Spencer Abraham, 51% to Debbie Stabenow, the Democratic challenger. But look at that number, still very close with only 68% of the voters tallied so far. In Nebraska, the open seat, Bob Kerrey vacated that seat. The Democrat, Ben Nelson, is slightly ahead of Don Stenberg, the Republican. But look at the number, with 82% reporting, very, very close. Only 6,000 votes or so making a difference in Nebraska so far. In Montana, Conrad Burns slightly ahead of the challenger, Brian Schweitzer, the Democrat. Once again, only 62% of that number is there. Let's talk to Stuart Rothenberg and see what's happening with those 4 Senate seats.
Well, Wolf, obviously these are just too close to call. It's amazing the narrow margins given the considerable votes already cast. Clearly, somebody like Conrad Burns is in better position. He's an incumbent. It's a conservative state. But none of these races look locked up at the moment.
It's going to be a long night for a lot of these races. They're going to be looking at absentee ballots. They're going to be looking at every precinct.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm sure you're going to have the legal teams flying out of there from the Democratic Senate Committee and the Republican Senate Committee to make sure they're checking with ballot security and recounts and soiled ballots, things like that. So I think, you know, some of these races could drag on indefinitely. definitely. And I just would add, Wolf, it's not just these races. I was noticing a couple of the House races. I had referred to a New Jersey race, Dick Zimmer against Rush Holt, and my computer showed 100% of the vote in, and I looked a few minutes later and saw 100% of the vote in still, and a slightly different result. The latest result actually has Rush Holt ahead of Dick Zimmer by 56 votes. I don't know if that's a final or just a preliminary final.
Although we will recap, we are projecting that the Republicans will maintain the majority in the House of Representatives. Back to Judy on the National Desk.
All right, Wolf, thanks to you and thanks to Stu Rothenberg. A little while ago, we were in Aurora, Illinois, speaking with the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Dennis Hastert. We're going to go back to him now. Mr. Speaker, as you look at more of these numbers coming in, and as you look at this very undecided presidential race, what are you thinking about in terms of making government work in the next few years?
Well, clearly, we have to reach across the aisle and try to do things on a bipartisan basis. I think the president, whoever he's going to be, I certainly hope it's George W. Bush, was going to have to do the same. And I think we're looking for people, and I think the American people are looking for people who are willing to bring people together and get things done. And that's what I've tried to do since I've been Speaker, and I think that's what we'll continue to do.
We've noticed a number of Democrats who work with you in the House have commented on the difference in style between you and your predecessor, Newt Gingrich. Did you go into this position deliberately wanting to be a different kind of leader in the Congress?
Well, I felt very strongly when I became Speaker that we had to prove to the American people that we could get some things done. And I talked about a better education in this country for our kids. We talked about supporting our men and women who serve this country and our national defense. We talked about balancing a budget. We talked about paying down the debt. And we talked about not taking a penny of the Social Security and Medicare Trust Fund and spending it in general revenue funds. We did those things, and especially balancing the budget, paying down the debt, and protecting Social Security. That's never been done before by any Congress. So I think that type of getting things done is what the American people wanted.
Some people have had the impression that Governor Bush, and I'm not clear on this, did not campaign or spend much time campaigning with and for Republican members of Congress. Set me straight on that. How much campaigning did he do with members of the House, members of the Senate?
Well, he actually campaigned with a lot of our members. And when he was in a district, our members were there with him, and especially our members who were vulnerable and our challengers that we needed to get out and get some recognition. He did a very good job, and we're pleased with his cooperation.
Do you agree with his characterization that there has been too much partisanship, too much just bitterness and fighting and division in the nation's capital that needs to be healed?
Well, you know, I tried to get beyond that when I became Speaker, but clearly Dick Gephardt wanted to be Speaker. He set on a policy of trying to stop everything so we would have what they called a do-nothing Congress, and try to blame that on us so that they become the majority. That didn't happen. And in spite of what those tactics were, we did get a lot of things done. And the things that we did do were done on a bipartisan basis. The marriage penalty was done on a bipartisan basis. Tax relief on death was done on a bipartisan basis. The PNTR for China was done on a bipartisan basis. The sweeping banking reform was done on a bipartisan basis. So we will continue to do that.
Well, then, does George W. Bush's characterization hold up?
Well, I think sometimes that people don't really see what goes on, but I think the president can be very helpful to us in trying to help and reach across the aisle in the House and in the Senate to try to get things done on a bipartisan basis.
Mr. Speaker, it's Jeff Greenfield. Some of your colleagues have said that the culture has changed, that there was a time when people would battle politically and then go home and have dinner together and meet each other's families, and that there was a kind of much more collegial atmosphere, and that without putting blame on one side or another, that it's become a much less civil place, that is to say the Congress of the United States. Is the closeness of this election, do you think, potentially a piece of evidence that says to people on all sides that the culture just has to change, that the sniping and the partisanship and going on television and yelling at each other with talking points is just had it?
Well, I think you've watched my performance. I haven't been on television every time you turn around. I've tried to make the House work and to bring people together to make that House work. I think that's what the American people want. A lot of the people who are shrill aren't there anymore. We've had some real changes, and you know, some of them even lost in this election. So I think we're well on the way. I would certainly offer my hand across the aisle so we can get some things done.
Well, that's when
but you have to realize one other thing there is a difference in philosophy between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and we do that fighting. It's for philosophical differences as well.
Well, when you point out that some of the shrillness is gone and some of the bitterness has faded, perhaps, that's why I'm asking this characterization that George W. Bush was talking about out on the campaign trail repeatedly day after day during this campaign. I guess I'm asking you, does it match the reality of what you've lived with in Washington the last 2 years?
Well, it's been a tough time in Washington the last 2 years. We had a 1.2% margin of error. Anytime that 4 members or 5 members of Congress got up on the wrong side of the bed, you know, the whole balance of Congress shifted. So, you know, we had to work hard to keep our people together, to move an agenda for the American people, a better agenda for our children and our grandchildren. It was tough to do, but, you know, we didn't lose many votes.
Mr. Speaker, today in talking with one of the people around Vice President Gore, he said if the Vice President wins, he made a bold prediction and said the Patient's Bill of Rights will pass in a lame duck session of Congress. Is that the way you see it, if the election were to fall to the Vice President?
Well, you know, we passed a Bill of Rights for patients in the House. We passed one in 1998. And
well, he's clearly talking
that.
about the one the Democrats preferred.
Well, we'll see.
All right, Mr. Speaker, we appreciate your joining us from Aurora, Illinois. It's late there, or I should say early there in the morning. It's early here, but we all want to keep a close watch on these results. Thank you very much.
Maybe not so early in the morning before the time we see how all this works out. So it's good to be with you.
Are you hearing anything we're not hearing?
No, it's just pretty. We're waiting for Florida.
All right. Dennis Hastert, the Speaker of the House. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Judy, that conversation you had with the Speaker should remind us of a word that has not been heard for a very long time: impeachment. I mean, to think that a presidential election could have been conducted about a year and a half or a little less than 2 years after the president was impeached, amazing. Bernard Shaw, sir?
We have a call. Let's go out to the Show Me State, Missouri, in that Senate race in which a dead man, Governor Mel Carnahan, is on the ballot. CNN is calling this for Mel Carnahan. His widow, as you know, agreed to run. And Mel Carnahan, his memory, and those who support him have defeated, turning out Senator John Ashcroft, a first-term Republican senator. What a development. Kate Snow. Let's go quickly to Kate Snow in St. Louis.
Bernie, I think you can hear the crowd here. They've got CNN on in the background, and with your announcement, a lot of excitement here. Mrs. Carnahan spoke to this crowd just a short time ago. She talked about carrying on the fire, carrying on her husband's dreams. She, of course, has not been very public in this whole campaign. In fact, voters here in Missouri only saw Mrs. Carnahan a very few times throughout this race over the last 3 weeks since the death of her husband. They saw her in one ad that aired on local television here. They saw her in her announcement last week when she decided that, yes, she would take the position if the votes were to go to her husband. But other than that, they haven't seen much of Mrs. Carnahan. She is right now at home with 2 of her daughters in Rolla, Missouri. That's about an hour and a half south of where we are in St. Louis. This race has been close all night long. Senator John Ashcroft just a short time ago telling his supporters that they could go home now, that he would have more news for them in the morning. We don't expect to hear from him again anytime soon. Again, very good news for the Democrats here in Missouri, especially in light of the fact that George W. Bush seems to have won this battleground state. Bernie?
Kate, even though she didn't campaign per se that much, she did put up one ad, did she not, within the past 7 days?
She did. Last week, she started running one ad where she talked straight into the camera, a very personal kind of ad, talking about her Remember disappearance of her husband and talking about her goals for Missouri. She does not have a public record. She has not served in public office, but she has been very vocal about the kinds of issues that she wanted to take to Washington. She's talked about education, about women's issues, about children. She's talked about reforming Social Security and some other issues, tax cuts, targeted tax cuts. So she has said all along that she carries her husband's mantle and that she wanted to take that to Washington. Bernie?
Kate, it's Jeff Greenfield. Kate, we know that Mrs. Carnahan and the Carnahan people adopted that slogan, keep the fire going, but we've heard that some Republicans were threatening a legal challenge on the ground that a dead person is not an inhabitant of the state, which Missouri law requires. Can you tell us anything about whether they intend to pursue that legal challenge?
I've asked that question all night. They will not comment on what kind of legal challenge they might mount, but I might add, Jeff, that in addition to the constitutional question, there's been a lot of local news here tonight about the polling places and about the numbers coming in and people being allowed to vote or not allowed to vote. The Republicans voicing some concerns. They say that they think there has been some potential fraud here in St. Louis, in the city of St. Louis. You'll recall that they kept the polls open a little bit late tonight because a judge earlier in the day, a state judge, ruled in favor of the Democrats, who had argued that they needed a little more time because some of their folks hadn't been able to vote. There's been a lot of back and forth today about whether there were any irregularities. I would expect that we might hear more about this tomorrow. Jeff?
Kate, are the Carnahan people banking on the fact that when this woman goes to Washington, Senate Republicans have already indicated the obvious, that they control the rules of the seating in the Senate? Are the Democrats and the Carnahan supporters banking on the fact that who is going to throw a widow out of the Senate seat? Who's going to refuse to seat this woman?
I'm sorry, I can't hear the last part of your question.
Are the Carnahan supporters banking on the fact that it's unlikely the Republicans would want to take on all the public relations heat if they would not let this woman take this seat?
Simply can't
well, we'll call timeout, and we'll call timeout, and thank you in that cheering ballroom. Judy?
All right. We've, as Bernie said, we've called Missouri for the late Governor Carnahan, and as Bernie's been pointing out, and as Kate's been discussing, it is his widow who has said that she will accept the seat if appointed. Let's go over to our balance of power area to Wolf Blitzer for some examination of this and some other Senate, House, and governor's races. Wolf.
Judy, with the call for the late Mel Carnahan to be the winner in Missouri, let's take a look at the balance of power in the Senate as it now stands. Coming into this evening, there were 35 Republican holdovers, 31 Democratic holdovers. The Republicans so far tonight have won 14 Senate seats. The Democrats have won 17 seats. That brings the new number of Republicans with 49 seats. The Democrats now have 48 seats. There are still three undecided seats that we'll talk about in a moment. But only a little while ago, before this call by CNN in favor of Mel Carnahan, Mrs. Jean Carnahan did speak out. She had some emotional words on a speakerphone. I want you to listen to what she had to say a little while ago.
Lincoln never saw his nation made whole again. Susan B. Anthony never cast a vote. Martin Luther King Jr. never finished his mountaintop journey. My husband's journey was stopped short, too. And for reasons we don't understand, the mantle has now fallen upon us. We remain heirs of a legacy, bearers of the dream. On this night, I pledge to you, rather, let us pledge to each other, we will never let the fire go out. God bless you always. Thank you.
This is Jean Carnahan, the widow of Mel Carnahan, speaking out a little while ago. Let's go back to the National Desk and Bernard Shaw.
Well, and what may make it even sweeter, Candy, is that we can report to you that it's a trifecta tonight. The Republicans, CNN is calling that the Republicans do retain control of the United States Senate based on victory we're calling in Montana for the incumbent Republican, Senator Conrad Burns. The challenger, Brian Schweitzer, he has set back the Democrat. This is, as Bill Schneider's been pointing out throughout the evening, the last time when the Republicans ended up in control of the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. Dwight Eisenhower was in the White House. It was 1952. They then subsequently lost control of the House and the Senate 2 years later, but for 2 years, they had all three.
And now they've controlled the House and Senate since the election of 1994. They came to power in 1995, and they've kept it ever since then, which is quite remarkable.
One thing we should point out, just to do the arithmetic, the reason why we know the Republicans will control the Senate is that the best the Democrats can do is to get to 50-50. And with the election of George Walker Bush, it means that Dick Cheney, the vice president, breaks any tie in the Senate. So that's where we are now.
Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that Mr. Schneider is going to be using the words irrational exuberance as a warning to the Republicans. Yes. I have a feeling. I think what we heard from Speaker Hastert and Trent Lott was some words of restraint, that even if the Republicans control all three of these institutions, there may be a certain degree of rational non-exuberance because of the narrowness.
Imagine the religious right. Imagine the gun owners. They're waiting for the Republicans to deliver, and for years they've been saying, but we need the White House. We need the White House. Now they have no excuse.
We have a race to call. The Senate race in the state of Nebraska goes to Ben Nelson, the Democrat. He defeats the Republican Don Stenberg. This means the Democrats hold on. This is the seat of retiring Senator Bob Kerrey. It is a hold, a retention, if you will, for the Democrats. We now have a Bill Nelson in the Senate from Florida and a Ben Nelson from Nebraska. You got that?
Yes, and it means that the Democrats have at least 49 seats in the Senate, and if Debbie Stabenow beats Spencer Abraham in Michigan, the Senate will break 50-50, and Vice President Cheney will break the tie.
And we should say, we haven't mentioned Dick Cheney's name in the last few minutes. We are projecting, estimating, calling the next Vice President of the United States, 59-year-old Richard Bruce Cheney, born in the state of Nebraska, but grew up and hails now from the state of Wyoming. And he's been Secretary of Defense. He's been White House Chief of Staff. He knows Washington.
Which is why he's on the ticket. Because George Bush has never worked in Washington except through association with his father.
Speaking of the phrase absentee ballots, we're going to revisit our call in Washington State in that Senate race. This is it. We are going to put back into the too close to we're going to put back into the too close to call column this race in which we earlier had projected the Republican incumbent Slade Gorton was going to go down to defeat. Officials in Washington State say the absentee ballots are being counted, and they're not finished counting. So we back off.
Do you think somebody's trying to say, do you think the voters might be trying to tell those of us who are anxious to count these results before all the votes are in?
We started this evening.
Please wait until they're all counted.
We started this evening. I said the voters are of two minds in this election. They appear to be of two minds throughout the country. In just about every major race in the country, they are split down the middle.
Maybe one of the things that will happen with this election is, considering the way that the calls have gone, whether George Bush or Al Gore gets elected, I think they're going to have an attitude toward the television networks that might not be friendly. And we, or at least the election system, has caused both campaigns enormous agita through this night.
CNN's political director Tom Hannon tells me it will be 10 days before that absentee ballot situation is clarified in the state of Washington.
In Washington State.
It will be, presumably, it will be November the 18th before we know whether it's Maria Cantwell who takes the seat over as a Democrat or whether Slade Gorton retains that seat as an incumbent Republican.
Yeah, we do know that there's been an enormous surge of absentee balloting all over the country this year. Many states have made it much easier to cast absentee ballots. You don't have to have a reason. You can do it just for reasons of convenience.
Gentlemen, and John, stand out for just a moment, please. Let's go back to our balance of power desk here in our big newsroom here in Atlanta. Wolf Blitzer and Stu Rothenberg.
Bernie, we've been doing some historical review to see if there are any cases similar to this in the state of Florida. And Stuart Rothenberg, who's been studying Congress for many, many years, he's come up with one example. Stuart, tell us what that example is.
Wolf, it's a 1988 U.S. Senate race. Connie Mack and Buddy McKay. Buddy McKay was then a U.S. representative. Connie Mack was a banker. When he went to bed that night, this is a U.S. Senate race, as I say, when they went to bed that night, Buddy McKay thought that he was the United States Senator. After absentee ballots were counted, Connie Mack ended up winning.
And I want to point out also that our excellent producer, Chris Carino, remembered that incident as well. Let's take a look at the balance of power to see where it stands right now. And of course, we don't know yet who the next president of the United States is going to be. Let's take a look at the U.S. Senate. For example, the Senate, we now have 50 Republicans who will be in the next Senate, 49 Democrats. There's still one seat that is up in the air. That seat is in Michigan. What do we know about the race in Michigan?
We know that it's too close to call and that Debbie Stabenow, a congresswoman, has a narrow lead over U.S. Senator, freshman Senator Spence Abraham. Out of 3 million votes cast, just a few thousand votes are separating the two candidates. It is a squeaker in a night of squeakers.
And let's, though, point out that even if Debbie Stabenow, the Democrat, defeats the incumbent Spencer Abraham, it would be 50-50. But either way, if the Democrats win the White House or the Republicans win the White House, the Republicans would still be the majority in the U.S. Senate. You want to explain that, why that is the case?
Well, simply if George Bush wins the White House, then Dick Cheney is the vice president, becomes the president of the Senate, and he's able to break a tie vote. On the other hand, if Vice President Gore becomes the president, then his running mate is Joe Lieberman. He also ran for the U.S. Senate this year. He'd have to resign his Senate seat. The sitting governor in Connecticut is John Rowland, a Republican, and he would appoint a Republican to replace Lieberman in the Senate.
So as a result, the Republicans will retain their majority in the U.S. Senate, irrespective of what happens in the presidential contest. Let's take a look at the House of Representatives. We have reported that the Republicans will retain at least a narrow majority in the House of Representatives. Stu, where does it stand right now?
Well, right now, Wolf, the Republicans actually have picked up one seat. However, there are a number of seats that are still in play that are actually leaning Democratic or where a Democrat has an advantage. Interesting, only one incumbent to this point has gone down, Sam Gadenson of Connecticut. But there are a number of other seats in play. Congressman Jay Dickey of Arkansas is behind. Congressman Jim Rogan, a Republican from California, is trailing, as is Brian Bilbray, another Republican. There are a couple other seats in play.
Let me interrupt, because even as you were speaking, Stuart Rothenberg, we were told by our executive producer, Sid Bedingfield, it's now official in California. Adam Schiff, the Republican challenger, has defeated James Rogan, the Republican who was the House impeachment manager in that race in California, narrowly defeated. It was a close race, but we are now reporting the Democrat, Adam Schiff, a pickup for the Democrats in the House of Representatives.
And just to mention two other incumbents who are in trouble, Steve Kuykendall in California is in a very close race with Jane Harmon, a former Democratic congresswoman. She's trying to reclaim her seat. And David Mingy in Minnesota is in a very difficult race. Not expected to be as tight as it is, but it's quite tight. It looks as though the Democrats are probably going to net a seat or two or three in the House, narrowing the Republican majority, but the Republicans are still going to control the House.
Two veterans were in very, very tight races. Clay Shaw in Florida. What do we know about that race? He's the Republican 20-year incumbent who had a difficult challenge from Elaine Bloom.
Well, I think we know by now not to call too many close races to be sure that we know who has won. But it appears as though Clay Shaw may be hanging on by a fingernail. Throughout the evening, this race seesawed back and forth. First Shaw was ahead, then Bloom, now Shaw, but it's very, very close. There are going to be plenty of recounts in these House races. As we mentioned, there's a New Jersey race where incumbent Democrat Rush Holt may have beaten former Congressman Dick Zimmer. I say may have beaten because the margin is something like 56 votes.
And another major race in Connecticut, another 20-year Democratic incumbent, Sam Gadenson. What happened to Sam Gadenson?
Well, he got blindsided by Rob Simmons, a Republican state legislator, former Hill staffer, former employee at the CIA, in a race in eastern Connecticut that I think, Wolf, turned on a local issue. It had to do with Indian rights and Indian property. There were some residents in that eastern congressional district, which has become rather Democratic, who were very dissatisfied with Sam Gadenson's performance. And as well, there were charges that he didn't live in the district and wasn't particularly responsive to local concerns.
Gadenson was the ranking Democrat on the House International Relations Committee. He goes down to defeat right now as a result of this challenge from Mr. Simmons. As a result of all of this, let's recap. The Speaker of the House of Representatives, Stuart Rothenberg, will remain Dennis Hastert.
It certainly looks that way, and I think the Republicans have to feel relieved, even if their margin is shaved, to maintain control of the House. They had much more exposure, much greater risk going into Election Day today than did the Democrats.
And the Speaker of the House who wanted to be the Speaker of the House, Richard Gephardt, must be majorly disappointed.
Well, you know, Dick Gephardt committed his heart and soul to this, to the fight for the House. He passed on a presidential race. He was out campaigning full-time for candidates, raising money. No, this was Dick Gephardt full bore to try to reclaim the House, and he didn't do it this time.
The Senate Majority Leader will remain Trent Lott, although very, very narrowly.
Again, the Republicans suffered some considerable losses in the fight for the House, whether it's 4 seats or 5. A number of members of the class of 1994 went down. Rod Graham's most notably, but some senior people as well. We mentioned Bill Roth before, as well as on the Democratic side, obviously Chuck Robb went down. You know, it's interesting, if the Democrats could have just saved Robb, or maybe offered a real top-tier challenge to somebody like Rick Santorum in Pennsylvania, we might actually see a Democratic Senate, but they fell just short.
And a major loss for the Republicans, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Bill Roth in Delaware, going down to Tom Carper.
Absolutely, and Slade Gordon, another very senior member, a confidant of the Republican leadership, so the Republicans suffered some real damage in the Senate races.
All in all, if you take a look at the trends, what we see in this very, very close presidential race, what we see in the House and in the Senate, what conclusions can we draw as of this moment, which is almost 5 o'clock in the morning? We've been here for almost 12 hours right now.
I think the obvious conclusion, Wolf, is this is a deeply divided country on the basis of partisanship between the Republicans and Democrats. There is no consensus on the direction of the country. The House is roughly equally divided. The Senate may well be equally divided. And we see a presidential race where the country is split.
And irrespective if Gore becomes the next president or if Bush becomes the next president, is all of this a prescription for gridlock in Washington, legislative gridlock?
It's hard to see how either party can really push a legislative agenda, a political agenda in Washington. In fact, if the Republicans were to narrowly win the White House and have Senate and House controls this narrow, I think the Democrats, starting tomorrow or the next day, would be licking their chops about the midterm elections in 2002. We are headed for political gridlock for the next couple of years.
And finally, one last point, Stuart. You've been looking at these presidential races in the various Senate, in the various states, and the gubernatorial, the Senate races, statewide elections. A lot of split votes. Bush won several states, but the Democrats picked up governor races as well as senatorial races.
Yeah, in general, it was a good year for incumbents. Having said that, the Senate is something of an asterisk. It may well be that more sitting United States senators were defeated this year than sitting members of the U.S. House. We won't know probably for a day or two. But in general, this was a good year for incumbents. But don't tell that to Republican senators.
All right, Stuart Rothenberg, you've been with me all night. Thanks for joining us. Back to the National Desk.
Well, that was one major question we sought to answer last night. Still cannot answer it at 5:40 a.m. Eastern Time. Another question involved the composition of the United States Congress, the balance of power. Let's again go to Wolf Blitzer for the latest.
Bernie, we've been spending all night, all morning looking at the balance of power. Let's take a look at the U.S. Senate, see where it stands right now. Right now, of course, everyone remembers there were 35 Republican holdovers coming into this race, 31 Democratic holdovers. 15 Republicans have now won this evening. 17 Democrats have now won. That gives the total number of Republicans in the U.S. Senate 50, Democrats in the U.S. Senate 48, 2 undecided. Now, who are those 2 undecided seats? In Michigan, Spencer Abraham, the incumbent Republican, he's barely behind Debbie Stabenow, the Democratic Congresswoman. A very, very close race. We cannot yet call this race. Debbie Stabenow slightly ahead of Spencer Abraham. In Washington State, Senator Slate Gordon and Debbie Cantwell, the Democratic challenger. This race we had earlier thought Debbie Cantwell will win, but not Maria Cantwell. But now we have decided that because of the recount in the state of Washington, this race is now too close to call. Stuart Rothenberg, even if both of these Democrats win, it will be 50-50, and that won't be enough, though, for a Democratic majority.
No, Wolf, the Republicans will still control the Senate, but it's really interesting that these two particular races should come down right to the end with us unable to pick a winner. I have been talking to Republican and Democratic operatives in these two states and these two races for some time, and it's interesting that in both cases the Republicans told me that they were well ahead and they felt comfortable that their candidates would win. The Democrats told me the exact same thing about their candidates. As it turns out, neither of them were right.
And for some of our viewers who may just be getting up this morning, Hillary Rodham Clinton, the winner in New York State over Rick Lazio.
Certainly a high-profile race, and many of us would have thought that that would have been the #2 headline to this presidential race. But what's happened in the presidential contest has so overshadowed everything and everything else that we almost forgot about Mrs. Clinton. Obviously, it makes her a national player, and New York a terrific platform for anybody, but particularly if, in this case, Al Gore falls short, Mrs. Clinton, of course, will get a lot of attention.
Two incumbent Republicans did go down to defeat Rod Grams in Minnesota, Bill Roth in Delaware.
And they were both regarded as the most vulnerable Republicans this cycle. We'll have to see whether other Republicans join them. But this was not a stellar year for the Republican Senate class. It was a combination of freshmen and some veterans who went down, vulnerable Republicans and good Democratic challengers.
One Democratic incumbent went down to defeat Senator Chuck Robb in Virginia.
Well, George Allen proved to be an extremely attractive challenger. He was conservative in a conservative state, but he's also a very likable, gregarious, outgoing, happy guy with an attractive family. He showed them in the ads. Chuck Robb, rather stiff, attempted to make the election about issues and about Allen's record. He didn't succeed, and I think all along Allen had the advantage.
As a result, Trent Lott, who easily was reelected tonight in Mississippi, he will remain the Senate Majority Leader. Let's take a look at the House of Representatives, the balance of power as we know it right now. 215 Republicans as of this minute, 207 Democrats, 11 still outstanding, 2 independents, as we all know. But of those 11 undecided, the Republicans only have to win 3 in order to have their 218 majority.
Right, and they look as though they will win a handful of those. Clay Shaw is ahead in Florida, though very narrowly. Shelley Moore Capito in West Virginia's 2nd Congressional District looks like she may very well take over a Democratic seat. Steve Horn in California leads narrowly, but the Democrats are going to pick up a number of these seats. They're going to make a net gain in the House. It may be 1 seat, 2 seats, 3, or even 4, but the Republicans are going to hang on.
In the House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House of Representatives will continue to be Dennis Hastert. We still have one gubernatorial race that is still up in the air. There were 11 races, but in Missouri, Bob Holden, the Democrat, Jim Talent, the Republican. Take a look at these numbers. A very, very close race in Missouri with 97% of the vote in Missouri. We just don't know yet who will be the next governor of Missouri.
One interesting tidbit that, again, Chris Guarino, our crack producer, researcher, has dug up. Since 1976, the party that has won the presidential race in Missouri has also won the governorship. Now, George W. Bush carried Missouri, but at the moment, the Democrat, Holden, is leading in the race for governor, so we might have a little bit of a history made there.
Stuart Rothenberg, you're one of the most respected political analysts in Washington. You've been studying politics almost your entire professional career. Have you ever seen anything like this in your political experience?
Well, Wolf, I think we've been standing here 12, 13, 14 hours, whatever it is. I may look as if I was born in 1876 in that memorable presidential contest, but I wasn't. But it's hard for me to believe that any political analyst, political observer American has seen a political contest like this since 1876.
And the presidential contest still up in the air even as we speak.
We've seen races, the presidential contest, Senate races go back and forth, calls made, having to be pulled. This is amazing, Wolf.
It's amazing for me, too, and amazing for all of us who've had the privilege to cover this story. Back to you guys on the National Desk.
Yes, right you are, Stu. It's not settled yet.